Years ago, I was working a night shift on a geriatric rehabilitation ward in an old hospital in Slovakia. It was the kind of place that sent shivers down your spine, even on the brightest of days. But during the night, when the darkness crept in and the corridors seemed to stretch on forever, it became a place of untold horrors. One fateful night, as I sat at the nurse's station, my heart pounded in rhythm with the steady tick-tock of the ancient wall clock. My colleague, Maria, and I were the only ones on duty. The rest of the staff had taken their breaks or retired to their sleeping quarters, leaving us to watch over the frail souls who occupied the ward. It was past midnight when we heard it, a loud crash followed by a blood-curdling scream coming from one of the bedrooms. Our instincts kicked in, and we sprang from our chairs, rushing down the dimly lit corridor towards the source of the commotion. As we approached the room, a feeling of dread washed over me. I couldn't shake the sensation that something was terribly wrong. We pushed open the door and flicked on the lights, revealing a scene that would haunt our dreams for nights to come. The bedside cabinet lay face down on the ground, its contents strewn across the room like a hurricane had torn through it. The drawer was inexplicably placed on the opposite side of the room, as though it had been hurled by an unseen force. But the most chilling part was that the patient, an elderly man named Mr. Novak, was still asleep in his bed, undisturbed by the chaos around him. The sensor mat designed to alert us to any movement from the patients hadn't activated. Maria and I exchanged bewildered glances, unable to comprehend what we were witnessing. Mr. Novak was frail and weak, unable to move, let alone throw a heavy cabinet across the room. Panic settled in the pit of my stomach as I realized that there was no logical explanation for what had just occurred. We decided to move Mr. Novak to another room for the night, thinking that perhaps it was a bizarre, unexplained phenomenon. As we settled him into his new room, we could hear our own nervous laughter echoing in the empty corridor. We couldn't shake the feeling that something unnatural had taken place. But this nightmarish incident was far from an isolated occurrence. Over the next few weeks, it happened 2 more times, always in the same room. Each time, a bedside cabinet would crash to the floor with inexplicable force, followed by a scream that seemed to emanate from the very depths of terror. And each time, we would rush to the room, only to find the patient still asleep, the sensor mat silent. The horror that gripped our hearts intensified with each incident. We questioned our sanity and the very laws of reality. Mr. Novak was moved to another facility after the 3rd occurrence, and still, the sinister events continued. Determined to uncover the truth, I decided to delve into the history of patients who had been placed in that accursed room. What I discovered sent chills down my spine and confirmed my worst fears. 3 of the last 5 patients assigned to that room had committed suicide while under our care. The room seemed cursed, tainted by an evil that defied explanation. My panic escalated, and I felt an urgent need to inform the hospital administration. This was a matter that couldn't be ignored for the safety and sanity of all who worked there. But when I voiced my concerns to the higher-ups, they dismissed me with a scoff, attributing the incidents to mere coincidence and overactive imaginations. Their indifference fueled my anxiety, and the room seemed to taunt me, a malevolent presence lurking just beyond the walls. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching, waiting, hungry for something more. As the days turned into weeks, I became increasingly uncomfortable working on that ward. My nights were plagued by nightmarish visions of the room, its eerie silence broken only by the crashing of furniture and the agonized cries of its unwitting occupants. I could no longer bear the weight of the fear that pressed upon me like a leaden shroud. One night, as the clock struck midnight, I made a life-altering decision. I handed in my resignation, determined to escape the malevolent grasp of that room and the sinister secrets it held. I couldn't help but feel like a coward, leaving my colleague Maria to face the horrors alone. But my own sanity was at stake. Relief washed over me when I finally left that dreadful place. The hospital's facade faded into the distance as I drove away, leaving behind the shadows that had haunted me for far too long. 2 years after my departure, I received word that the hospital had been closed down. Rumors of unexplained phenomena and inexplicable tragedies had spread like wildfire, and the facility was deemed unfit for human habitation. The memories of that nightmarish room and the horrors it contained haunted me still, but at least I was free from its malevolent grip. I am a 27-year-old male, and this story took place before the world was thrust into the grip of the COVID pandemic. At that time, I was confined to a hospital room, grappling with excruciating back pain that had brought me here for an overnight stay. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a sterile, haunting glow, and the soft hum of medical equipment provided a disconcerting soundtrack to my discomfort. Around 11 p.m., unable to sleep and craving a momentary escape from the bland hospital room, I decided to step outside for a cigarette. The crisp night air was a welcome change from the antiseptic atmosphere inside. As I reached the hospital entrance, I noticed a surreal sight. Other patients, all clad in hospital gowns like me, huddled together near the designated smoking area. I lit my cigarette and joined them on a bench, drawing in the acrid smoke and exhaling slowly. It was there that I struck up a conversation with an elderly man seated next to me. He had a weathered face with deep-set eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. He had been staring at me ever since I sat down, and it was hard to ignore the intensity of his gaze.
Terrible place, isn't it?
He rasped, his voice brittle like old paper. I nodded, more out of politeness than anything else. Yeah, it's not the most comfortable spot in the world. He leaned in closer, his breath heavy with the scent of cigarettes.
You don't understand.
He whispered conspiratorially.
I've been held against my will here for weeks.
I was taken aback by his statement. What do you mean? This is just a hospital. They're here to help us. The elderly man's eyes darted around, as if he feared being overheard.
No, you don't get it,
he replied urgently.
The staff, they're not who they seem. They're keeping us here, experimenting on us. We're all just guinea pigs in their twisted game.
My confusion deepened, and I offered, shouldn't we get help then? Call the police or something? He shook his head vehemently.
No. It's too late for that. They're always watching. We need to run right now.
With trembling hands, he began to remove the hospital wristband from his frail wrist. As he did so, I noticed a security guard approaching, making his rounds. Panic washed over me, and I looked back at the elderly man who was struggling with the wristband.
We need to go now,
he hissed. But before I could react, the security guard was upon us. What are you two doing out here? He asked, his tone stern. The elderly man turned to me with wide, desperate eyes.
We missed our chance,
he said, his voice filled with regret. The security guard escorted us back inside, and the elderly man's grip on my wrist tightened.
We'll have another opportunity,
he whispered as he was led away. I was left, standing there, my heart pounding in my chest. The hospital suddenly felt like the setting of a horror movie, and I was trapped in a nightmarish plotline. I returned to my room, feeling more frightened than I'd ever been. The rest of the night passed fitfully, my mind racing with thoughts of the elderly man's strange claims. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong in that hospital, but I had no way to verify his words. Morning came, and I was startled awake by a nurse who had come to take my temperature. She offered no explanation for the previous night's events and went about her duties with practiced efficiency. I felt like I was in some surreal, silent thriller where the truth remained just out of reach. The following day, despite the terrifying encounter with the elderly man, I was discharged from the hospital. The pain in my back had subsided, and I was grateful to leave that eerie place behind. As I walked out the hospital doors, I couldn't help but wonder about the elderly man's fate. Had he been genuinely paranoid, suffering from a delusion brought on by illness, or was there a sinister truth hidden within his words? I'm not sure if this is the right place to share my story, but I can't keep it to myself any longer. It's been haunting me for years, and I hope that by sharing it here, I can finally find some closure. This is a story about a creepy male nurse I encountered in a hospital, and it's something I'll never forget. It was a cold, dark winter evening when I found myself in the emergency room of St. Mary's Hospital. I had been suffering from a high fever, and my body ached with every movement. The waiting room was filled with people, all lost in their own pain and misery, waiting to be seen by doctors and nurses. I found an empty seat and sat down, shivering from a combination of fever and anxiety. After what felt like an eternity, my name was called, and I was led to a small examination room. A middle-aged nurse with thinning hair and glasses introduced himself as Mark. He had an air of unease about him, like he didn't want to be there. I didn't think much of it at the time, attributing it to the late hour and the demands of the job. Mark began the examination, asking me routine questions about my symptoms and medical history. He was cold and clinical, but I assumed that was just his way. As he touched my arm to check my temperature, a chill ran down my spine. His touch was unsettlingly cold, and his eyes seemed to linger on me for a moment longer than necessary. I tried to push aside my unease and continued to answer his questions. But as the examination progressed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about him. He seemed too interested in my personal life, asking questions about where I lived, whether I lived alone, and if I had any family nearby. I answered truthfully, but his probing questions sent alarm bells ringing in my head. As Mark finished the examination, he told me that I would need to stay overnight for observation due to my high fever. He assured me it was just a precaution, but his smile seemed insincere. He left the room, saying he would return shortly with the necessary paperwork. Alone in the dimly lit room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I decided to trust my instincts and began to gather my things. Just as I was about to leave, I heard a faint whisper outside the door. It was Mark, speaking to someone in hushed tones. I strained to listen and heard my name mentioned. They were talking about me. Panicked, I quietly opened the door and peered into the hallway. Mark was standing there, talking to another nurse I hadn't seen before. Their conversation stopped abruptly when they noticed me. Mark's eyes met mine, and I saw a flash of anger and panic in his gaze. I turned and bolted down the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out of there, away from Mark and whatever sinister plan he had in mind. I ran through the labyrinthine corridors of the hospital, my fevered mind struggling to find an exit. Finally, I burst through a set of double doors and found myself in a deserted wing of the hospital. It was eerily quiet, and the flickering fluorescent lights cast long, unsettling shadows. As I stumbled down the hallway, I heard footsteps behind me, growing closer with each passing second. I couldn't go back the way I came, so I ducked into an empty patient room and hid in the darkness. My heart was in my throat as I watched Mark and the other nurse pass by, their faces twisted in frustration. I stayed hidden in that room for what felt like hours, waiting for the coast to clear. Finally, when I couldn't hear any more footsteps, I cautiously emerged from my hiding spot and made my way to the hospital's main entrance. I reported the incident to the hospital administration and the police, but no one could find any trace of Mark or the mysterious nurse. They claimed that there was no record of such individuals working at St. Mary's Hospital. To this day, I have no idea who they were or what their intentions were that night. I never set foot in that hospital again, and I still shudder at the thought of the creepy male nurse and the whispered conversation I overheard. I'll never know what they had planned for me. I had a pretty spooky experience about a month ago. It all happened during my stay at the hospital for knee surgery. The procedure had involved grafting cartilage from my knee to my ankle, and recovery was far from comfortable. To make matters worse, the surgery ward was overcrowded, so I ended up sharing a room with two elderly men in the urology ward. The hospital was understaffed, especially during the night shifts, which meant that the night nurse rarely checked on us. I had resigned myself to the eerie silence that enveloped the ward at night, with only the occasional hum of machines to break it. But nothing could have prepared me for what occurred on the second night of my stay. I woke up around 2 a.m., disoriented and groggy from the pain medication. At first, I thought the soft glow illuminating my face was the night nurse attending to her duties. However, as I blinked away the fog of sleep and focused my bleary eyes, I realized something was horribly amiss. The source of the light wasn't a nurse, but rather a lone light bulb hanging above the door to our room. It cast eerie shadows across the sterile room. Panic set in as I scanned the room, my heart racing. My eyes landed on the door, and that's when I saw him, a wraith-like figure in a hospital gown, his bony frame illuminated by the ghastly light. The old man, frail and emaciated, seemed to hover by the door, swaying slightly as if unsteady on his feet. Our eyes locked and my voice caught in my throat. I tried to speak, but fear had rendered me mute. He made a slow shh gesture, his cracked lips forming a twisted smile, and then he began to inch closer. With a trembling hand, he extended a finger to his lips, urging me to silence. Then, in a move that sent chills down my spine, he slowly closed the door without a sound. I watched, frozen, as the latch clicked into place, sealing us in darkness once more. Morning came, and I couldn't shake the bizarre encounter from my mind. The sun's rays brought a false sense of security, but I needed answers. When the nurse made her rounds, I mustered the courage to inquire about the strange visitor from the previous night. Her face darkened, and she explained that the old man had undergone surgery, just like me, but had suffered a paradoxical reaction to a drug. In his delirium, he believed he was in jail. And that night, he had wandered through the hospital with a bleeding wound from his surgery, attempting to escape. As she spoke, the unsettling reality of what had happened struck me like a hammer blow. I had been sharing a room with a man who had lost touch with reality, and I had been utterly defenseless in my weakened state.